All right, good morning. This is Seaside High School, American Government. And this is my third period class. They're a little chattier. We don't mention any names, right? Jetta, Corey, Sequoia. Our discussion today is over Chapter 2, Sections 4 and 5. We'll start off with Section 4 as we look at the objectives. They pop up here on the screen. They're also on the wall over here in the blue. Okay, so we're going to look at who are the framers of the Constitution. We're going to look at what are the differences between the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. If you know your U.S. history, you know that New Jersey is in the northern part of the United States and Virginia is in the southern part of the United States. So that might have something to do with the two different thought processes of how government should work. What were some of the compromises? What were some of the compromises that brought us to the Constitutional Convention and what they agreed upon? And then we're also going to look at the sources that the delegates drew on to create this new Constitution. Okay. And remember, these are all up on the board over here, or you can also catch them on Google Classroom, right? You can pull up the notes. How many people are following the notes on Google Classroom right now? Excellent. That's about 90% of you. Okay, great. So, the framers of the Constitution. Yes, you could follow the notes on your phone.
My Wi-Fi
log
is
into your
stupid
Google Classroom.
here.
Except for Sequoia. She has an anti-Room 22 Wi-Fi password.
Whoa.
Yeah.
I thought you were just texting the entire time.
No, we don't allow that. Okay, here we go. So, you guys, the reason we call them the framers is because they built the Constitution just like a framer would build a house. The framers of the Constitution are the people that built this together. Be very careful about where you put the R. You don't want to have farmers of the Constitution. That doesn't work as well. Okay, you do not need to write all this down because you can access it through the notes. But we need to talk about this. Okay, so when we look at the leaders of this Philadelphia Convention, and let's go back before we get into just a little bit of time. If you recall, after the Revolutionary War, 1781, the United States government kind of puts together the Articles of Confederation, which is a really loose league of friendship. The Articles, as you guys talked about yesterday, had those 8 weaknesses. One of the most critical ones is they didn't have an executive branch. The legislative branch dealt with all the issues, and there was no way to enforce any of the laws that the Articles of Confederation could create. So if you were the state of New York and you disagreed with the law that was being created by this Articles of Confederation, you just didn't follow it. Well, if you have different groups that are not following things or they only follow them when they want to, that obviously doesn't support the government at hand. And if you're not going to be supportive of the government, then it's not going to be able to fulfill its job. So that's where that meeting at Mount Vernon happened. And of course, George, you getting all this down there, Miss Smart? Yeah. Okay, great. So that's where that meeting happened at Mount Vernon, which was George Washington's house. And they talked about, well, what's going on. One of the real issues was just economically, every state had its own currency, and so just dealing with the exchange rates and trying to do business was really, really difficult. So they were talking about, how do we bring this together? Yes, Jetta.
Like, what was the currency? Like, what was the different currencies they had?
Well, it was all coins,
Oh.
but everybody just had their own type. A dollar for Maryland, and Vermont had a dollar, and New York had a dollar, but they were different. So the exchange rates weren't the same. Okay, so looking at this time period, and this is one of the reasons I think you guys as 18-year-olds, seniors in high school, can really relate. You're really close to self-sovereignty, right? So close. Okay, you're going to graduate from high school in June. You're all going to move out of the house sometime between, more or less, you're all going to move out of the house sometime between the day after graduation and probably somewhere in September. At that point in time, you are going to have complete sovereignty over what you do. So if you think about this revolutionary time for America and the colonies and the states, They came from an oppressive government. Now, I'm not saying that your parents are oppressive, but they definitely are probably enforcing rules upon you that you don't want to be following. And that's what the king was doing to the colonies. So when they broke away, they were going to go for the system that had the least amount of governmental control possible. And that was the Articles of Confederation. That had the least amount of any central governmental control. You guys are going to do the same thing. You're going to go for the least amount of control. Now, some of you will figure out by the end of October that having some self-control or some guidelines to follow in your life is going to be really good. Some of you, it'll take 40, 50 years, somewhere in between. If you go off to college and you make it into winter term, you're going to notice that there's a whole bunch of kids that didn't come back for winter term that were there in the fall. They hadn't figured out how to get self-control yet, and they flunked out. And it's not a bad thing. You have to figure it out. The states did the same thing. They figured out what is the least amount of control that I can have and still have a functioning government. That's what they wanted because they were deathly afraid of communism. No. Wrong century. They were really afraid of a monarchy coming up in the United States and having one person in control of the government telling everybody what to do. Okay, so these guys get together. And some of the leaders here are James Madison. He's the 4th president of the United States. If you see Yuli Corona today, give him a high five because he's the one that came up with that information. Nice. It's a pretty banner week for Yuli. Governor Morris, he helped create our economic system, as well as Alexander Hamilton. The only way you guys probably know Alexander Hamilton is he's on the $10 bill. He was never president of the United States. He died before he got the opportunity. He was shot by Aaron Burr. That's another story. And then George Washington. Now, when we talk about George Washington at this particular point in history, if I was to mention 3 people that are pretty well known, pretty popular in the United States. So if I said Johnny Depp, LeBron James, and Beyonce, that's who I was going to say. If I put those 3, and I said, hey, I just got a text, they're downtown at Fotano's eating lunch, how many people would skip out of class and take the consequences to go meet them?
My education.
Yeah. Okay. Most of us would be down there. So, my point here is, George Washington has the same star power that those 3 do now times 10. He could do no wrong. He was almost. There you go. Exactly. And that statement was made in the last class. Yeah, he had this charisma, and everybody was just like, "Oh, you saved us from the king. You can do whatever you want." And so, in that, whatever George said, lots of people just said, "Okay, let's do it." So he was on the side of let's create a new government. Now, there are also some people out there that said, if you're trying to throw out your current government, isn't that kind of treasonous? If we tried to overthrow our government now, wouldn't that be treasonous? Very much so. We'd be thrown in jail. So you had Patrick Henry, and his big quote is, "I smell a rat," and he because what are you doing? We don't want a stronger central government. That's why we got moved away from Great Britain, because we didn't want something really strong. Then you have Samuel Adams, John Hancock. They were part of the Declaration of Independence. They're not even there. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, he's in Paris. John Adams, he's the 2nd president of the United States. He's in Great Britain. So you have a lot of really prominent figures that aren't involved in this. So it was kind of like, where is it coming from? Did you just wait till these people were gone? And so you could subvert your new governmental system in? And so there was a lot of those thoughts. That's what you need to know about this page. Okay? Moving along. All right, so different plans. So as this group gets together, and if you look in your book on page, I think it's page 50, you'll see a picture of George Washington there, and he's talking with the framers, and they're all in their wigs, and they've got their neck ties on, and their wool coats, and their knickers, and they're all dressed up. Now,
They're what?
they're called knickers. It's a type of pant.
Oh.
You don't wear them.
Oh.
They didn't have jeans.
Oh.
Or air conditioning, or electricity. So, if you were getting together with a group of people and you were going to change the way your government worked, would you want to do it in a big public forum? No, they did it secretly. They did it in Philadelphia secretly, and they did it in the summertime. Who's been to Philadelphia in the summer? Okay. Parker's been to Philadelphia in the summer. Parker, what's the weather like in Philadelphia in the summertime? Toasty. Is it humid?
Yes.
Is air conditioning your friend?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my point, here's my point. 55 guys. Okay. Before plumbing. 55 guys in a room in the summertime where it's hot and humid with the curtains drawn and the candles lit so they can see because they don't want people to hear. They didn't even take notes of what they talked about. James Madison would go up in his diary and write a little bit about what happened each day, but they wanted it to be secret in case it didn't go well. They didn't want to get thrown in jail for being treasonous and overthrowing the government. But the conditions are not super conducive. You know, it's not like air conditioned. They had people bringing them, water and they had a buffet. None of that kind of stuff. These guys felt very passionate about creating a new government, and that it needed to be in place because the one that they had wasn't working. All right, so this group from Virginia came up with a plan, and they suggested that the new government have 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial branches. They also suggested that there was a bicameral legislature. Now, I think you've heard this term a couple times, but I don't know if we've ever really explained it. Bi meaning 2, cameral is a house of legislature. So they wanted 2 houses of legislature. That means anything that was passed had to be passed in one house and the same thing in the other house in order to move on. Well, if you have to pass the same piece of legislation twice by 2 different groups, is that more difficult than having one group pass it? Does that make government less powerful if they have to pass it twice? Yes, because they have to go through more steps, right? It's harder for them to do things. If it's harder for government to do things, then it makes the government less powerful. Okay, they also thought that they should have a national executive. And remember, the Articles of Confederation did not have an executive branch. They had a legislative branch. And the legislative branch could create all these great rules, and they could create a rule for all the states. And if Maryland didn't want to follow it, they didn't have to. They pledged that they would, but they didn't have to. So it's kind of like if Camden got a curfew by his parents, and you got to be home every night by 10 o'clock, and you showed up the first night after the curfew was set, and you showed up at 10:30, and your parents didn't do anything.
Oh, then you show up at 10:45.
Then
Yeah.
11.
It's telling you.
That was on recording.
It's telling you.
My boss bedtime, so
It's telling you that you don't have to follow those rules, right? It's critical at that point. You're thinking, well, if I don't have to follow the rules, then I can do what I want, and that's kind of what was happening with the Articles of Confederation. Okay, so let's look then at the New Jersey plan. Now, New Jersey is from the northern states. A little less population in New Jersey than Virginia, quite a bit less actually. Smaller in size as well. And New Jersey they wanted a unicameral Congress. Now, if they wanted a unicameral Congress, were they thinking that they wanted a stronger government than what we currently have? Okay, we had the Articles of Confederation, and how many houses did it have? It had 1. There were only 13 delegates, and every state was equal because everybody got 1. So they wanted to keep that plan in place. They wanted equal representation for different size states. So that was the idea that everybody would get the same amount, no matter how big each state was. This is the big difference here in the 2 plans, really, is they wanted 3 presidents. And then your presidents would have to have a majority, a quorum. They'd have to have all 3 there to meet on anything, and then they would have to have 2 of the 3 would have to say yes to get anything done. Does that really limit the power of the executive branch if you have to have 2 or 3? Yeah, so let's just take our top 3 candidates from the last presidential election: Trump, Clinton, Sanders. Let's make them all 3 of your presidents. And they all have to, 2 out of the 3 have to agree to get anything done. We might not get anything done, right? So it'd be pretty crazy. But you can kind of conceptualize, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about creating a government that's not too strong. because they're still very afraid of going back towards the idea of a monarchy. Okay. So we got a formal assessment, so go ahead and get out your ABCD cards here, please.
Always be closing.
Okay, here we go. The New Jersey and Virginia plans for the new Constitution included 3 branches of government, bicameral legislature, 1 based on population and 1 based on equal representation. Make sure you understand what the question is asking. C, a leader for the executive branch, or D, all the above. Okay, respond. What do you guys have? All right, so the correct answer is D, all the above.
No, you didn't, John.
All right, good. It looks like we're doing pretty well for the collective whole. Remember, if there's things that you're not sure about, put a star by me. We can always talk about it a little bit later. Okay. So looking at the compromise. Now, you had 2 different groups, 2 different philosophies, and we had to come to a compromise. So the Connecticut delegation said, let's do this. Let's create a bicameral Congress, and one of the houses has equal representation. Everybody gets the same amount per state. Let's give them 2. So each state has 2 no matter what. And then let's create the second house based on population. So if you have 1 million people in your state and another state has 25, you get a number of representatives based on that population. So what we have today, and I'll use Montana and California as examples. Montana has just under 700,000 people. They have 2 senators and 1 representative. California has somewhere around 45 to 50 million people. They have 52 representatives, and they have 2 senators. So Montana and California have the same number of senators, but the representation is different. So really, the representation in the House of Representatives is based on representing you as a person more so than it is representing the state, isn't it? Yeah, because it's representing you as a person more so than the state, because they're based on that population piece. Whereas if all the states are equal, then you're just representing what the state wants to do there. So, but it divides government up. It makes it more difficult for government to do anything, to exercise any powers. Okay. Some other things that they compromised on. 1 president. They decided to have that legislative, executive, judicial branches. There were some other compromises that needed to be addressed. And as I mentioned before, the North and the South. So you had slavery as a lifestyle, a way of living in the southern states. And this was very integral in how not only production of cotton crops and tobacco crops were taken care of, but just in the way socially the South worked was different than in the North. So in the southern states, and as this is coming, as they're creating this, each group is looking at how can I make government more responsive to us as a society or us as a state. They did this under the Articles of Confederation. They're starting to do it even though when they're creating the Constitution. So they came up with this 3/5 compromise. And how this comes about is the southern states said, we want to count the slaves as population. The ironic thing here is they wanted to count them as people so they could get more representatives in the government, but they didn't want to count them as people for anything else. They were counted as property. If you had slaves, it was the same as having cattle. That they meant the same thing in a court of law. No rights whatsoever. Now, I know that's kind of ghastly, or very ghastly, but that was society at that particular point in time. Yeah, pretty crappy. So the southern states said, yeah, we want to count the slaves as population. Well, the northern states shockingly said, sure, no problem. That's going to give you more representation? Not that big of a deal, because they're trying to figure out how can we pay for things like our revolutionary debt, building up our military to protect us for the future, those kind of things. And at this point in time in U.S. history, the way people paid taxes was what's called a whole person tax. Everybody paid a tax based on being a person. If you're going to count the slaves for representation, are they going to be counted as a person? Yep. And then they would have to pay taxes on them. So now you have a plantation owner who might have 500 slaves, and they have to pay taxes on all of those slaves.
Like, hold up.
Yeah. So they so the South said, oh, no. Yeah, let's back off of that one. We don't like that idea. So what they did is they came up with 3/5. For every 5 slaves, it counts as 3 for representation and 3 for taxation purposes. So it was a little bit less. The North was able to generate more money. The South got a few more votes. Ultimately, by the time, now this is 1787, so it's, 85 years later that we have the Civil War to kind of settle this issue. Yeah, it takes a while. Yes, Miss Adeoye. Just stretching. Okay, great. So, moving on. Michael Bailey. The Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise. So, 2 other things that they felt they needed to settle. And this is one of the issues under the Articles of Confederation. Every state was taxing other states as they transported goods in and out of their states. So if something came from Connecticut to New York would charge a tax for it to go from Connecticut to New York, even if it was just passing through. And that was that economic issue that they were all having problems with. So they did some things to settle that. One, they said there wasn't going to be any taxing in interstate commerce, and you couldn't tax any exports for the entire country. So we, as a new country right now, are sending lots of raw materials out and some finished goods to the rest of the world. Didn't want to tax those. They also said that they weren't going to do anything for the slave trade for 20 years. Now, this is 1787. By the time this is ratified, 1788. So that means in 1808, from that time period up to 1808, they couldn't do anything with the slave trade. Couldn't make more restrictions, couldn't lessen restrictions. They just left it alone. It's kind of like, when there's something that you have to do, but you really don't, like put your clean clothes away. And you don't want to put your clean clothes away, so they just sit there. And it's kind of like saying, you know what, I'm not going to do that for 20 years, we'll just come back and do it later. But what happens, it becomes worse, doesn't it? When you put it off and deal with it later. Yeah. It's always better to, it's not fun, but it's always better to do those things early than it is later. Okay.
You can always go and look in
You can always get on Google Classroom and check it out. So the key here, lots of compromises between these 2 groups. People that wanted a stronger central government and people that wanted a weaker central government. You're having all these compromises, and a lot of them are, yes, North and South, but they're really philosophical at this particular point in time. Okay. So let's look at who influenced this new Constitution, and we'll check out some reactions. So, Locke and Rousseau, those names should be familiar from Chapter 1 when we talked about social contract theory, right? I mean, these guys were saying, hey, look, you've got to create a government that's responsive to the people, and the strength of the government depends on what the people want. You might be able to have a representative democracy that's super, super strong as far as a form of government, has lots of power, or you can have one that's really weak, and there's places in between. Also, they looked at the Second Continental Congress, they looked at the Articles of Confederation, and what isn't talked about very much is they looked at the state constitutions that were already there. The state constitutions had 3 branches of government. A lot of them had bicameral legislatures. They had a judiciary branch that was dealing with discrepancies within government or between citizens. So the foundation is there. It wasn't like they just sat down at the table in this hot, sweaty room in the summertime and said, hey, let's get out the chalkboard and draw out what we want to do as a brainstorm and figure it out. There were some ideas. Okay, what were the reactions? Well, remember, they're doing this secretly. They just convinced a bunch of people a few years earlier to fight Great Britain. Now they're going to convince this group of people that they need a stronger government. That's going to take some time. So, right away, there were some people like George Mason who said, you know what, it's not what we want. Now, this is not a real critical thing. Neither one of these two guys are, just to give you an idea. So Benjamin Franklin, basically, what this quote is saying to you is that this is the best we could do with the best that we have. We got the brightest brains together, and this is the best they could come up with. So no matter what you think about it, it can't get any better at this point in time. Maybe in the future, you might be able to do some things to adjust it. But right now, this is the best it's going to be. So don't knock it. Let's go do it. All right. Well, he says, from such an assembly of fallible men can a perfect production be expected. So basically he's saying, this is an incredible group of people. Could you expect perfection? If you expect perfection, you're setting the bar way too high because there's no way it's going to be perfect. All right, couple A, B, C, D questions here. Number one, the first national government for the United States was it the First Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, the Articles of Confederation, or was it the Constitution of the United States? And respond. Oh, we've got lots of C's. I've got a B. I've got an AB. All right. So, hey, you guys, just really briefly, maybe we should look at the question. The first national government for the United States. And this is where you have been taught incorrectly because we weren't the United States until we put together the Constitution. So the answer is the Constitution of the United States. Letter D is the correct answer. That's okay. It's okay if you missed that one. Lots of people do. All right. Here we go. The Constitutional Convention of Philadelphia involved delegates from each of the following states except. So which state was not there? Now, this one you have to go back to probably section 2 and think about, or maybe section 1, and think about which state might not want to be there. And let's take a guess. Remember, this is just a formative assessment. Go ahead and respond. I got some C's. I've got some A's. Got a lot of A's in the middle here. I've got a B. Why B, Jake? You're just guessing, no rhyme or reason? Okay, so you're narrowing it down. Good job. Well, the correct answer is B. Now, and here's why Rhode Island didn't want to be there. What type of colony were they?
Oh,
They were a charter colony. And a charter colony basically had been running their own government since day one. So they
they're like, we don't want to change.
Yeah, so for 100, almost 200 years, they've been running their own government. Why would they want to change to this? They liked it really, really, really localized form of government. Okay, great. So before we get into, we can start here. Ratifying the Constitution. So we're going to look at who are the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The root word there is federal. We'll talk about that here in a moment. How long did the ratification of the Constitution take? And then we're going to look at what happens after ratification. All right. Now, just by the name, Skylar, Federalists, Anti-Federalists, it would suggest that these two groups oppose each other, correct? All right, so let's check it out. The Constitution was very controversial because some groups supported it, some groups attacked it. Was it changing our form of government?
Yes.
Yes. Was it changing changing a form of government typically by the government that's in place is an act of treason. So there was a lot of skepticism here as how do we proceed with this? The Federalists, and I'll put both slides up here for you. The Federalists wanted a stronger central government. They felt that the Articles of Confederation were too weak. They didn't like the fact that one state could be really powerful over another state, and that there wasn't a semblance of unity between the states, especially economically. So when I write, I have federal written up here on the board, and next to it I have central government, because the federal government is the central government. The idea of federalism is a multi-level government. So what we're looking at here in the Federalists, they wanted a stronger central government. They didn't want a king, but they wanted a stronger central government. So the Anti-Federalists, they wanted to make sure that government didn't get too powerful. They liked a lot of the control at the state level. So I have here a picture on the board with our national, state, county, local federalism diagram on it. And the Federalists would more align with having more power at the state level than at the national level. So they didn't like the Federalist idea that the national government had more power. And so they argued back and forth. And kind of predicate what the next slide is going to talk about. They didn't get on Twitter. They didn't get on social media. They didn't Snapchat. They didn't get on television or radio.
Well, what do they do all day?
They wrote letters to the newspaper. And then the people who could read, and remember there was no public education, so if the only way you were going to be able to read is if you had money to go to school, because there wasn't just school for everybody. So these letters would be read then in the community, and they were arguments for and against the new federal government. So the Anti-Federalists, they weren't so against the Constitution itself, but they didn't like the fact that the new government didn't have some type of check, some type of way to keep it from becoming more powerful. Because they understood that if government's going to be run by humans, humans are constantly going to want more power, exactly. So one of the things that they were advocating for was the Bill of Rights. Now, every state already had a Bill of Rights in their constitution, something that restricted the power of government. But there wasn't one for the national government. And the Anti-Federalists were arguing that if we don't restrict the national government, the state constitutions aren't going to be strong enough to stand up to it. So we need to have the Bill of Rights added. So ultimately, they compromise. Let's get into a formative assessment here. The Federalists and Anti-Federalists disagreed over what? The size of the new United States, the strength of the federal government, the length of the Constitution, or the number of representatives given to each state. And show me your answers. Oh, you guys are doing great. Yes, letter B. Letter B. Good. Excellent. Excellent. You did. Good guess. Okay. So, ratifying the Constitution. Now, there's a big difference between ratifying something and passing something. At the governmental level, if you pass a bill to become a law, that means it passes at one level. So it would say it can pass at the state level or it can pass at the national level. If you ratify something, it means it's going to pass at multiple governmental levels, not branches, but levels. So if we ratify something, it's passed at the national level and then ratified at the states. So the Constitution, for it to become something that everybody was going to follow, it had to be passed at the national government level. That's what the framers did. And then it went out to the states to be ratified. And they needed to get every state on board in order for it to work. Now you can see some states jumped on board right away, and some it took a little longer. Don't worry about all the little dates and things on the left-hand side there. But just looking at the diagram, you can see Delaware was a real quick state to get on board, and then Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts. I mean, all those guys were in that winner, and their votes weren't that close in reality. But as you get down here and you look at some of the other states, like New York, and the number of delegates is the sovereign decision of the state. So that's why some have more and some have others. North Carolina, okay, it was defeated the first time, and then of course you have Rhode Island at the end, and that was 2 votes between being part of the U.S. and not being part of the U.S. When we look at the Federalists and their push forward on this, and the Anti-Federalists, I wouldn't contend that the Anti-Federalists the whole time wanted that Bill of Rights to be put in. I don't know if that is necessarily accurate, but they did a really good job of making sure that it became part of the Constitution. So as all the states ratify, this Constitution, there's no Bill of Rights. So we have to add that in afterwards. And that can't be added in until after Congress meets. So in reality, Congress meets for the first time in March 4th, 1789. When is the birth of our nation that we celebrate? July 4th, 1776. That's when we declared independence. The birth of our nation, of the nation we know today, is actually March 4th, 1789. That's when Congress finally meets. They don't even get a quorum until April 6th. If you know the Northeast in the wintertime, it's very hard to travel around. So it took a while for people to get there. Yes, Astor.
To show up to school on March 4th then?
No, you'll be here on March 4th. I think March 4th is a Sunday. But so George Washington is inaugurated on April 30th, so he becomes our president. And at the time, the electors voted. They had two votes, one for the president that they wanted and one for the second president they wanted. John Adams got the second most votes, so he became the vice president. And does anybody know the party of... I know, that's why I said.
How do you know that?
Because I live in the calendar all the time. So I just happen to know. More like a calendar. It's figures.
Wait, no, it's not. It's a Saturday.
No, it's a Sunday.
Why does Google say March 4th? Day of the week, 2017. Oh,
Yeah.
You screwed up again.
That's what. All right. So George Washington is elected president of the United States, and does anybody know what his political party was? Was he a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist?
Federalist.
He was neither.
He
He was neither. He supported the new Constitution. He also supported the idea of the Bill of Rights. He's the only president that didn't have a political party. Now, if we look into from George Washington on, the Federalists want a stronger central government. The Anti-Federalists want a weaker central government. The Anti-Federalists, remember, want the states to have more power. Doesn't that sound kind of like our political parties today?
Yeah.
Democrats want a stronger national government, and the Republicans would like the states to have more power, want a weaker national government. It's not that they don't want to do anything. They just want it to be a little weaker. Both systems work. The hiccup that we are getting in today is that the belief that if you believe in one system, then the other system is just totally idiotic. And that's not the case. And our framers sat down and said, look, your idea is a little different than mine. How do we compromise? How do we do what's best for the
people
the
vote
best?
on it.
And what we're in the world we're in today, it feels kind of like we're in this, well, if it's not perfect, then it's horrible. Instead of saying, hey, let's take a stab at this. Let's try to get this done. Let's compromise. Yeah. So hopefully we'll get there one of these days. All right, a couple questions for you here as we wrap things up. The debate over ratification of the Constitution was won by who? I think that there's one really good answer, and I think there's one that you could argue is the correct answer on this. So you have your choices are Anti-Federalists, the Whigs, the Federalists, or the Tories. And the Tories were part of the colonial rule of the colonies, the leaders of the British. All right, go ahead and respond. I got lots of the letter C. Okay, that's probably your best possible answer. You could argue A if you said that their whole plan was to get the Bill of Rights involved initially, and that's why they wouldn't sign on. Okay, here's a tough one. You would only get this probably if you've read the chapter. So I'm just checking to see who's read through section 5, because remember I've suggested that you read the section beforehand. So, the temporary capital of the United States where Congress met in 1789, was it Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, or Mount Vernon? And respond. What do you got? The temporary capital where George Washington was president was the city of New York.
Oh my God.
That's why I put it up there. Okay. Well, nice job, you guys. And that concludes our lecture today.